Now, on the idea of why the internet is anti-democratic per se, no thank you. The thing with the internet is that there's no accountability, and we believe that in order to have a functional democracy, or in order to have a democracy that can be called democratic or a force of democratization, it has to function somewhat as a democracy. And we believe that it is inherently valuable in a democracy that you don't have direct democracy, but democracy is a means by which you can elect people higher up in the food chain, and those people can go higher up until you get to one person or a few people. But in internet land, what happens is it's basically anarchy. There is no sort or semblance of a power structure, or people do not respect any form of power structure. If you want to actually say that the internet is a force for something, it's maybe a force for, cults. That's what the internet is. It's basically a collection of small cults that might respond to one specific authority but never interact within these authorities. And because the internet can never actually rally behind something and actually support something and actually elect, a leader of the internet or something absurd to that extent, we believe that the internet is inherently anarchic because every person believes that they are fully powerful on the internet and they are just as powerful as anyone else, not conceding to the idea that there is a larger goal within society. And that's why even if we would concede that someday it might get there or that it might have some sort of impact, that's why we cannot concede that the internet is the basicest and most powerful force of democratization within the world today, because it is inherently people participating in it do not actually value the idea of democracy, but value the idea of themselves online, expressing their own opinions and maybe communicating with people, but rarely changing ideologies, rarely changing dogmas, just accessing information. And if their sole basis in case is on the idea of information and access to it, well, I think they've already lost. Because again, information as it exists in the world is not sufficient enough to say that it's a force for something. A force for something has to actually be used in a way in which we can say, yes, it has been a force that has done X to Y to Z, like in physics. So at the end of the day, we see that Dave has shown you very aptly why even in their world, we see that the internet has inherent mechanical and technical flaws to why it is not the most large spread and the most powerful force of democratization. And secondly, we say that inherently the internet is not a force of democratization per se, we just perceive it to be so because we are a democratic country. I'm sure that the Chinese don't see the internet as being the greatest force of democratization, even though they have it. So again, it's all a matter of opinion and perspectives. But as long as we do not see real impact and real perspectives in a wholly unison way, then we cannot call the internet the greatest force of democratization in the world, and that is why we are proud to oppose.
Thank you, Radu. And now I invite Dave for the last speech from the opposition's team.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Now, to decide this debate at the end of the day, you have to ask yourself, what is the biggest force? Does it sound likely that it's the internet? And essentially, what we've been talking about is they tell us, look, there's political discussion and education. And we've shown you there's not that much political discussion, and what education does get throughout the internet gets through to very few elites, essentially not the typical internet user. The typical internet user doesn't go online for education. What you've then shown me is of what political education does exist for those people at 1 in 6, 1 in 12 with full access do get there, in many places is redirected into non-democratic concepts by censorship and by simply advocating non-democratic systems, which is rampant online. So we say, you actually end up saying it's not a force, it's a force that's neutral to democracy, or maybe in fact a force damaging democracy. Why? Because its very nature is not a democratic one. Nobody cares what 90% decide on Twitter. The question is, who owns the website? So by its very nature, at the end of the day, at the end of the question, internet denies democracy, is simply a direct property anarchy environment and not a democratic one. So we say that the internet adds up to just being anti-democratic, or at least being neutral to democracy. And then you have to compare, you're right, you have to compare to other things, or like water and the Pope. But the question is, fine, the internet doesn't send you home with an idea of democratization, but gets you thinking. And we're saying, let's look at things that aren't 1 in 12 people, that things that are around the globe. We're saying paper. However outdated to us privileged people paper might be. No, paper around the world gets into the hands of most people. Paper around the world and reading and typing and printing presses, which are still used in some places around the world, is what gets ideas through. The concept of informal education is what gets these ideas through. The concept of people communicating through social circles and forming community ideas is what getting through. In all of the places without internet, that's what's pushing democratization. Most of the places in the Arab country weren't massively connected there. And then it leaves me with the proposition. This in itself obviously shows how the internet is nowhere near the greatest force, because the tool just doesn't have to be a good tool. It has to be a good tool being used massively, which the internet is. Which leaves me with the proposition idea of it's enabling stuff. Again, paper enables more. The concept of we can organize protests better. Mobile phones organize protests better. Its mobile phones have had a much bigger impact on democracy in the fact that people can privately try to have a conversation, can dynamically have a conversation whenever they feel like it, can coordinate for a protest. So even as looking, cell phones versus the internet, we have a clear-cut standard. When you get looking at paper, at the concept of putting down information in repeated versions of the same concept so that ideas can be exposed, again, massively overtaking the internet. If you look at the concept of social interaction, that is to spread ideas, that is minorly upgraded binary in, again, 1 in 12 places, we again see that no, the things pushing democratization today is nowhere near being the internet. The internet is a nifty tool, hope it gets bigger, hope it does more for democracy and becomes less frivolous, but right now, it just isn't.
Thank you, Dave, and now I invite Sherban to end this debate.
Ladies and gentlemen, if we accept the logic on opposition's side, there is no tool for democratization. There is no democratizing force in the world. Because jihadists sometimes use the internet, because there are communist websites, because there are anti-democratic forces posting stuff on the internet is not a democratic force. Just like because there are books that are anti-democratic, books are not a democratizing force. Just like because violence can be used in any way, their example, that's not a democratizing force. So they've shown us no example of a democratizing force. So by their logic, there isn't such a thing. There doesn't exist. Nothing is democratizing because nothing is purely democratical. The internet is obviously a means, it's an environment. The internet isn't a democracy activist. The internet is an environment which, as long as it exists, is a force for enabling democratic forces. Obviously it's a force for the anti-democratic forces as well. But why is it more importantly a force for the democratic side? And we've told you this. Like David's talked to you, basically summed up their position that paper and books are the most democratizing force because they spread education and so on and so forth. What we say is, exactly, paper and books do that and have done that. The difference is, it's much more expensive to buy a book than it is to read on the internet. It's much more time costly. It's much less accessible to access information in the old environments of using paper than it is with the internet. Jonas also told you how the internet gives you the chance to express yourself, not only take information like books, like TV. And we think this is why it's the greatest democratic force, because it gives all of these great things that books and print and TV and radio have been giving us, and we all know that these have been used in the communist bloc, have been used so on and so forth. We think that the internet takes them to the next degree. And we also see that in the past 20 years, when you've had internet, you've had more countries turning from dictatorship to democracy than ever else in history. They're going to say, I think they actually implied it's circumstantial. We see it's not circumstantial. Because what the internet does, it allows people to access issues and to know what's happening in the world. They've never tackled this point. They've never tackled how people have the chance to express themselves like they've never had before. They've only said some people use it for frivolous reasons. Really? Some people use life for frivolous reasons. That doesn't mean that life isn't like the environment in which we express democracy. We think that, yes, some people don't choose to be active. We think that's a shame, but we think that as we have people today, the internet offers like the greatest channel to promote democracy. We think it has already done that. They've not shown us an alternative of a greater democratizing force. We're not saying that the internet means perfect democracy and only democracy. We're saying that so far in the history of the world, it's been the greatest democratic force. We think we've proven that.
Hai să trecem pe română. Foarte brusc, ne cerem scuze. Asta a fost dezbaterea. Acum, în fine, nu știu dacă este cea mai luminoasă dezbatere pe firmamentul dezbaterilor de până acum, nu știu, așa. Ce vreau noi să discutăm prin asta, să arătăm prin asta, dincolo de subiectul pe care l-am discutat, este modul în care funcționează dezbaterile. Adică cum există două părți și, indiferent de ceea ce credem, poți să găsești argumente pentru fiecare parte. Adică în terenul de joacă al dezbaterii se găsesc destul de puncte de vedere care să poată fi folosite. Ok. Cred că am putea să oprim filmarea. Aș mai zice ceva despre proiect, totuși că e proiect finanțat prin ACTA, care este Agenția Executivă pentru Educație, Audiovizual și Cultură. E foarte important să le mulțumești facilitatorilor, așa cum ar trebui să-i mulțumim și internetului. Mulțumim! Așa.